Okay, good evening. Is there anyone online?
Not
Not yet. Okay, we just started. Good evening to the people not online. Good evening to the people who are here. Good evening to the people who are not here. So it's been a little while. I think last month we missed, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so wait, before we start, maybe it's good to just get situated, as we say, and to think, I always say that everything we do has a motivation, so even when you're driving here, sitting here right now, there is a motivation in our mind, somewhere in the back of our mind. So the trick here is to make that motivation more obvious. So usually, if you think about what got you here and why you came, that's the motivation. And then there's motivation why we're sitting as well. There's kind of two motivations. The one that got us here, and there's the one that's present right now that may be very subtle, very hidden. So we look at those as very, very important, because actually it's a motivation that determines the quality of an action, okay, not the action itself. Actions do matter, of course. Some actions are more painful and more harmful, I should say. Definitely. But you can't judge even then by whether it's a harmful action or not. What determines harmful or beneficial or non-beneficial is the motivation. Okay? And so especially when we're talking about this topic, this time is about low self-worth, low self-esteem, then motivation becomes a very important part of how to transform low self-esteem. Okay? It's really super important. There's other things that we'll talk about too that are important in transforming it. So before we start, then I think it's good just to, for a second, just to recalibrate your motivation, or our motivation, I should say, into what would be a more wholesome motivation if you haven't got one. So a non-wholesome motivation would be one that just is sort of unconscious. Okay? That would be not a very great motivation, because then there's not much payoff. So if the motivation is strong, there's a lot of payoff. So you can think about, I don't know what people's background is, Buddhist, non-Buddhist, Christian, non-Christian, Jewish, not Jewish, But if you think about what's the highest motivation that you have in your life, it could be even from a political point of view, the motivation to reduce anger and political division, those kinds of things, more harmony, whatever it is. So whatever in your life is the most exalted motivation, okay, then think for this hour and a half, or however long, hour and a half, 2 hours, that we're meeting, and just think that, at least for you, that the intent will be to further that thing that you're motivated for. Okay? So if it's world peace, then what we do here is will contribute to developing world peace. If it's to, become a more spiritual person, then the motivation, you can think, okay, whatever I do here is going to result in furthering my spiritual development, or as a better person, or enlightenment. Okay? So maybe just think for a second and recalibrate. Okay? Okay, so as I said, the topic this time is about low self-worth. This is something we've wanted to do for quite a long time, I think. It's popped up. We did some surveys, and this one was one of the top ones, right? And it's a very fascinating topic. What's the word? The advantage I have, the excitement, or I don't know, excitement's maybe too strong word, but what's the word I'm looking for? The interest for me is that these are very common terms, right, in therapy or in our culture these days, right? We talked about anger, we talked about depression, we talked about anxiety, we talked about low self-worth now, we've talked about what else we talked about? We try to find these cultural situations or problems and see how does Buddhist psychology or Buddhist thinking apply. And it does. But sometimes we have to really twist things around. So what I'm going to present to you is a little bit of modern psychological thinking about low self-esteem, but then more about sort of teasing out what is the Buddhist approach to this. So, okay, so that's what we're doing. And by the way, as you know, people know me, interaction questions are fine. They're a good idea, okay? Because I can, if you don't ask me questions, I might ask you questions. And I don't know if you want that. When I've told it many times to people here, but when I used to take teachings from my teacher, Lama Yeshu passed away in 1984. When he gave teachings, large group, well, it was large group or small group, I used to hide behind the pillar. It didn't work. He still found me. He pulls you out of the whole crowd. Right there. So you can run, but you can't hide. Is that what they say? Yeah. Okay. So, typically when you do PowerPoint or these kinds of presentations, you're not supposed to put too many words. So I apologize for that. I could just, somebody's saying, maybe I should just read it, right? Seth Godin, who's one of the best, most popular presenters, and who I learned some things, I don't know him personally, but his way of presenting, he puts one word up. Or he puts a picture of a pink elephant. He's a great presenter. That's what you're supposed to do. But anyway, I'm not so disciplined. So here we'll just throw this out and we'll go on to another slide pretty quickly. Self-esteem reflects an individual's overall subjective, emotional evaluation of his or her own worth. So it's just simple, it's the way you think about yourself, the way you value yourself, the image you have of yourself, and it's how worthy or unworthy you see that, okay? It's good to define it because, we use the word quite frequently, but I don't know what the definition would have been. Myself, I wouldn't have really. It is the decision made by an individual as an attitude toward the self. So, when we use the word self, right there, it's red flag as a Buddhist. So we're going to get into that. Okay? Self-esteem encompasses beliefs about oneself. For example, I am competent, I am worthy, as well as emotional states such as triumph, despair, pride, and shame. Quote, the self-concept is what we think about the self. Okay, that's actually interesting. Self-concept is what we think about the self. I don't know if that means the definition of the self. Probably it means self-concept is what we think our identity is. Okay? So in Buddhist psychology, that is the number one topic, actually, I would say. What is self-identity? Okay. Self-esteem is a positive or negative valuations of the self, as in how we feel about it. That's pretty good. So that's pretty simple, right? Okay. So when you talk about our self-worth, it's our personal value in terms of how we feel others value us too. It's interesting. So there is an objective reflection that happens. That's very common. We're judging ourselves based upon how we think others see us. Interesting thing about that is, what if we think the way they see us is not how they see us? Right? What if the way they see us, we think they see us that way, is not how they see us? Or, if you turn that around, and this happens probably more frequently, what about the way they see us and we don't know how they see us and we see ourselves differently? It's like when people say something about themselves and everyone's going, really? I don't think that's true, right? It's like when we were at breakfast once with my younger son. He was probably about 10, 11, 12. He was playing baseball, and he was pretty good. And he was playing and we went to breakfast with one of his friends and his father. And his father was saying to my son, Keldon, you're just too humble. He might say he wasn't shy. I don't know what he's just too humble. You're a very humble young man. And then his son said, "Yeah, but I'm so humble." Everyone cracked up. It's like, okay, you get these little. Anyway, no one saw him as humble, but he saw himself as humble, right? Thank you for the tea. So we do judge our own self-worth based upon how others value us. And this is again very important. We'll get into this because this is also a trap. And how we view the way we are and how we value ourselves, okay? This is very interesting too. If you think, not this, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud right now. Okay, thinking out loud, yeah. We watch this political spectrum that's happening, this circus that's going on. And certain politicians, I have to be careful, right? People could be watching this all over the place. But certain people's what they state, how people see them, is just not how people see them. Most people don't see them that way. And we all sort of scratch our heads. Now this isn't here, but what is missing there for that kind of person? What do we call that that's missing? It's an emotional intelligence quality. We know about emotional intelligence a little bit, right? So in emotional intelligence, if you don't know, in emotional intelligence there's 16 competencies, and no one has all 16. But the way to judge someone's emotional intelligence is you can actually do surveys with it, but you sort of rate on how they do on those 16, and there's always a weakness and wonder. But there's one of the 16 that is sort of one of the two most important ones, and it's this one, and it's self-awareness. Okay, there's also social awareness. That one's a little less important than self-awareness. It's interesting. So. But self-awareness is this thing about judging. You know yourself kind of how other people know you, in a general sense, because it is all very relative too, right? Okay, so you're aware of what's going on for you inside of you. You know if you're scared. You know if you're arrogant. You know if you're you know what your inner workings are. That's self-awareness. Okay, look at that first one. How we feel others value us, it can be different. That's social awareness. Okay? So positive esteem, so we're talking about childhood, and this is sort of the Western model. And I wish I had all these, I was reading all these different studies that are done, and so when we talk about positive esteem, it's for children in terms of, now you can think about ourselves as well. Were you listened to as a child? Okay. Were you spoken to respectfully? Did you receive appropriate attention and affection? These have really deeper, studies going on, particularly around affection and attention, having to do with secure attachment. Do people know a little bit about security? Yeah, that has secure attachment. These are all, another way to say positive esteem, we could say secure attachment. These are the same variables that are involved in developing secure attachment. Interesting. Accomplishments recognized. So were you the type of person that came home? Well, I was the type of person. Came home with, on the report card, B's and C's, maybe an A now and then. What was recognized by my mother, though? The absence of A's. Okay? So that's not accomplishments recognized, isn't it? It's the message being for children is that's what's attended to. Okay, so you can use. So then the person develops a sense of self-image, correct? So that's why these are Western modern psychology does play a pretty interesting place in understanding this. In Buddhist psychology, they don't talk much about child's development. I don't know why. Maybe it was sort of uniform, generally speaking, how kids were raised. I think also for us in modern times, what do you think? Do you think there's more variation these days on how children are raised than, say, 100 years ago? I think, right? Values are different. There's a wide set of values. Yeah, it seems to be, right? How were mistakes handled in your family? Anyone want to comment? I don't want to be the only one talking. I have to disclose too much about myself. How were mistakes? What was the philosophy of making mistakes in your family? What was the value given to you around mistake making? No one's going to answer the two.
That you should try again. That's what I was taught at home.
Oh, good. Now, so there wasn't like a shaming?
No, I was quite lucky in that respect.
You're very lucky. So I'll just repeat for the try again was the message you got. What effect did that have on you, do you think?
I think it taught me that I could do things if I put my mind to them, and that there wasn't a real big sense of shame if mistakes were okay. Mistakes were okay. Not develop a sense of shame. I wish I was in your family. My family is interesting, though. Actually, my family was one of the few in the world that they didn't make any mistakes. Yeah.
It depended on who was making the mistakes.
In your family? Oh, really? Some people got different treatment.
Absolutely.
Why?
It was clear.
What do you think? How many siblings do you have?
None.
But who was treated differently then?
My mother's mistakes were not accepted by my father.
Oh. Mother's mistakes were not accepted by her. But how did your father relate to your mistakes?
He was more forgiving because I was a child.
Uh-huh. And we do know that there are many, just stereotyping, but fathers that are very hard on kids' mistakes, right? Buck up and man up or whatever, So he could have gone that way with you too, right?
Well, there was tough love, but it was just absolutely intense for my mother. It was
so it was ratcheted up for your mom. Much more intense. So at least, when mistakes are not permitted is what's interesting. That's what was kind of my family. It's like, so because they weren't permitted, there were none. That's the way they deal with it. It was someone else who made the mistake. Blame. Families that blame. It's pretty common. Yeah.
That's what we had.
Yeah.
Scapegoating.
Yeah, and even blaming others. Like I think if kids didn't do good in school, then I've seen this even today. It's kind of almost more common that if your child's not thriving in school, sometimes it seems to lash out at the school itself, the teacher, the educational system, because the parents care about how the child's welfare. I mean but what are they giving in terms of self-esteem or self-worth to that child? What do you think? We could imagine. Well, the child's going to learn that when she's not doing something right, it's not about him or her. So then they don't know how to take accountability. So I was thinking about the difference between positive self-esteem and then sort of negative self-esteem. Not negative, is that right? I mean, there's a self-esteem that's, I think, not healthy. A positive self-esteem that's not healthy. We'll talk about that. The difference is interesting. Not that I totally understand it. So, as in childhood, harshly criticized for developing low self-worth, low self-image. Good one to say is the low self-image. Okay? Harshly criticized. Physical, of course, we know physical, emotional, sexual abuse. Ignored. So there's there's lack of thriving. Ignored. Ridiculed or teased. And expected to be perfect all the time. Why would being expect to be perfect all the time lead to a low self identity, do you think?
Because no one can live up to that.
Exactly. So you're always seeing that you're not good enough. Painful. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what happened to the slides there. These slides feel more. Sorry about that. This is I tried a new PowerPoint program. It's really good, isn't it? So then it's about measuring up. So this is the other thing about in academics, intelligence. So people have a low dialogue in their heads about their not being smart enough, right? When I think about, so where we're going with this, when we talk about low self-worth, low self-esteem, really what I notice is that really what's happening, or where we want to focus, is there's a voice going on in our head. Do you know what I mean? There's a dialogue that goes on about not being good enough. And maybe people aren't aware of it, but that's really there's this kind of story that's going on. There's this dialogue. So an event happens, and then there's this dialogue that I'm not smart enough. Or if it's in athletics, I had a client the other day, I think he's about 50 years old. He's really scared about going, he's going on a different kind of diving trip in Mexico, which is free diving. He's a scuba diver. He's really nervous. He's surprised. But that's something about measuring. I don't think I'm going to measure up because I'm going with a lot of younger guys. It's a new thing, so his own sense of self-worth is being judged by his athleticism. Okay. Body image, of course, right? That's all of us, not just women. So men, of course, and even more so today. So now in the culture, it's being promoted quite strongly, right? That your self-worth has a lot to do with how you look for men now too. It was less for men, I think, before. More it was around achievement. It still is. But, wealth, achievement, your things, your car, your house, how you're providing. But now it's also, so socially also peer influence. Okay? This is also really intense. We hear a lot about bullying today, right? These days. That's that peer influence. So when kids are bullied, again, it goes back to believing in the messages that are being given by the peers. It's pretty hard not to believe it. You have to have a strong support system like parents, that can really give you an alternative to because peers are so important. Nicknames. Nicknames come from often nicknames are not very flattering, are they? Anyone have a nickname here? I know I won't ask you it, but did you have a nickname when you were a kid? Yeah, was it pejorative or positive? Negative. Yeah, mine too. Well, not all mine. I had several. Also, how you think about it, right? They could mean it negative, but you could take it positive too. Again, affecting self-image. So what we're really focusing on here really is the development of our self-image, and then the believing in that. Okay, that's where it goes with the Buddhist approach. Okay, Buddhist psychology. Yeah, we have a question.
There's a question from Robin. She asks, can you discuss about karma and non-judgment to include living love and compassionate action?
Absolutely, yeah. Is that recorded, the question? Is your mic recording?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So about, some people I guess I go too slow. We're definitely going to get to that, yeah. Just trying to set the context. And then Robin or anybody else, if I don't answer that question, be sure to remind me later. But we are going to get to that, okay? This is kind of what I think what we need to do is just have an agreement of what the problem is, and this is context. So if anyone has any, let me see what else I have here. Oh, a little more. Look at all the print up there. Told you I was going to break my rules. Indicators of low self-esteem. So I just want to get this out, that they're in agreement what the issue is, okay? Heavy self-criticism and dissatisfaction. Anybody know people like that? I'm not saying we are, but it's pretty prevalent. I don't even know if it's the majority of people. I wouldn't even go that far. But it's always around us. Heavy self-criticism and dissatisfaction. Hypersensitivity to criticism, with resentment against critics and feelings of being attacked. I want to stop there for a second. As you work, I don't know what, of course I know what kind of work you do, but have you noticed, depending on the kind of work you do, maybe you work pretty independently, but if you are in charge of managing people, or you work with people, or you're someone in charge, have you ever noticed that some people, just criticism is like, it's like speaking, what do they speak in Ukraine? Whatever. Have you noticed that some people, like I think that a criticism is hard for everybody because we're protecting that self-image, that ego. But the way that people deal with criticism is interesting because some people can't have any it's that self-awareness thing again. So they lash out, right? Lash out, they defend, they get angry at you, they don't hear it. Have you ever had that? So it's really interesting how you think that people can change. And so we have a good relationship, so we talk about, well, what I saw you do, it's really like, really when you were talking to that guy, you really dumped a lot of stuff on. Oh, no, I didn't. No, he could handle it. We've known each other a long time. That thing. And then you begin to feel like, okay, well, I'm wrong. A lot has to do with low self-image. And a lot of attachment to that low self-image because you're protecting it. Okay? Very sensitive to that. We know this. Chronic indecision and an exaggerated fear of mistakes. So, I have on the bottom of my email something Lama Yeshe told me once. So, he used to pick on me a lot, and I think partly why he used to pick on me was because I wasn't really much of a risk taker. Really, just play it safe. And if there was a failure potential, then I didn't do it. Because remember, my family didn't make mistakes. So I didn't know how to do something risky and make a mistake, so better to just not do it so you don't have to, deal with that. Does that make sense? But he kept pushing me. He wasn't going to let me. I was under his, what do you call it? When someone stares at you, under his gaze. I was under his gaze even when I was asleep. I couldn't escape him. So, he was just everywhere. They say in this Tibetan Buddhist tradition that the guru is like a freight train. It's always moving with a lot of power. And the other thing is we say that the purpose of the guru is to insult you. So it's not like a warm and fuzzy thing, but but it's compassion. The thing is, people sometimes don't understand the context. There's no ego involved. There's no sense of him doing it for him. He's doing it for me. The quickest way to help me. And I never doubted that. I might have hurt. I might have wanted to run away. I might have cried. All those things. I couldn't sleep sometimes. I would avoid him. I'd be scared. But there's never any doubt in my mind that all he was doing was benefiting me, and that was his motivation. So I have to give that context because people might not think he was abusive or something. Abuse is about the abuser's. It's about the abuser's ego and his own afflictive emotions involved. Lama Yeshe didn't have afflictive emotions, so it couldn't happen that way. So he always would try to keep me. Like I said, I hid behind the pillars. It didn't work. Figuratively and literally, I would try. And it's funny when I talk to other students who were close to him in a similar way. They said, "Yeah, I did the same thing." I used to have to sometimes take people up for their appointments with him, or I have to go do some work with him. And I would just stand outside his door for like 5, 10. I couldn't go in. I knew if I got in, I might get blasted, you know? Other people, maybe he would be strong like that. They didn't have the same reaction, maybe. I think anyone who was like that probably did have that reaction. So one time I was in charge, while I was there, one of the reasons I was there was to develop the Western Studies programs for the monks. We didn't have nuns in those days. Now there's a lot of nuns too. For the monks. And so we were the first monastery to bring in English, mathematics, social studies. And that was my job to bring that in. And so the other part of my job is, Tibetans, even though our monastery was not all Tibetan, we had Sherpas, Manangpas, other Nepali tribes too, we were considered a Tibetan monastery. So because the Tibetans had fled Tibet, and then Nepal didn't want to recognize them as refugees, because if you recognize them as refugees, then they would have legal status. And they didn't want them to be legal, because then they didn't want them to have any power. So Lama Yeshe asked me, he says, I want you to get the monastery registered. Well, registered means being legal. It was like an oxymoron. It was like being sent down this road to do this task that was essentially impossible. But I tried. I worked on it for a couple of years. And then I had a Nepali go-between, I guess you call it, or agent. And so the day came when I was going to have the meeting with the Minister of Education, because I figured out how to get it legally registered was registered as a school, and that would give it legal status. So this took 2 years or more to finally get to the point. I'm going to go meet with the Minister of Education, with my agent. And, of course, there's certain gifts involved. And because I spoke Nepalese, I could do usually they won't take gifts from Western people, but I was sort of local, and I spoke the language. So, but nonetheless, I gave the gift to my agent the night before, so that I wouldn't be handing it to the minister. Because that would, he wouldn't be saving face that way. He'd just be all. So I gave him to my agent, and then I'm going to meet him the next morning at 9:30 in the morning. It's like a half-hour walk from the monastery down to this area where we're going to meet near the road. I got there at 9:30, and he wasn't there, which is very typical because no one's on time in that country. And so I waited 9:30, then 9:45, and 10. It still wasn't a big deal. Maybe then around 10:30 I started thinking, where is he? And I knew where he lived. It wasn't far away. So I said, I'm going to walk over to his place. Weren't many cars in those days, by the way. And so I walked, and then I got to his house, and his house was all boarded up. And his next door neighbor, I asked him, hey, have you seen, his name was Rudra. Have you seen Rudra? And the guy goes, oh yeah, he left last night with his family. He packed everything and he's gone. My heart sank because he had all the money, and the gift was from the monastery, the money, which we were very poor. And I went, oh my God. So all I could see was Lama Yeshe. He's up there somewhere waiting. I got to go tell him. So, that walk back to the monastery is only half hour. It felt like 3 days because I just knew it was waiting there. And I went upstairs, finally made it back. I went upstairs, and Lama Yeshe was there, on the patio. I was expecting him to be in his room. On the patio, he looks at me and he said, so? Kind of gruff. So, what happened? And I had explained to him. I lost all this money. The guy absconded. And then he looked at me and he said, you should know Nepalese people better than that. Which, okay. And then he's walking away. He said, it's my students who make no mistakes that I keep my eye on because I know they're not doing anything. It's my students who make no mistakes I keep my eye on because I know they're not doing anything. So I'd taken a risk. I'd failed. But that wasn't at least I'd taken a risk. He was more interested. Otherwise, you don't do anything. And that was very different for me because I'm not a risk taker. So obviously I remember it to this day. That was probably 1981. So But what was my self-esteem like? That walk, that 3 days, three hour. It was 3 days. That half hour. How did I feel about myself? You know. So what we're going to talk about, what we're doing here is we're moving from how I thought about myself then as a failure, right, to how Lama thought of me. He took a risk. That's all I want. Now, I'm sure he didn't want to lose the money, but much more important. My father and mother never said that to me. You know. So your family, try again. You got a good message. So people who struggle with self-esteem often don't have that message, or they didn't receive that message in some other context, maybe in school or some other caregiver, or something that was really important to them. So it really shattered their self-worth. That can happen too. Losing a job or something like that, you know, or many different things a trauma could happen or event. But likely if you're brought up with that, you will have the ammunition to deal with those kinds of difficulties without beating yourself up. And, you know, then you can think about suicide, for example, where that goes, okay? Perfectionism is another one, indicators of low self-esteem, which can lead to frustration when perfection is not achieved. Neurotic guilt. Boy, these are interesting because I can think of different people dwelling on or exaggerating the magnitude of past mistakes. Pessimism and a general negative outlook. Sees temporary setbacks as permanent, intolerable conditions. These are interesting. Okay? Are these interesting to you? Or is this... Yeah, they're interesting to me. That's why I put them on there. Okay, we're gonna go. Don't worry, we're gonna get out of this. So, low self-esteem is the pain of inadequacy. I'm inadequate, and then you look at what you do as inadequate too. That's the perfectionism. It can be like that. When Lama Yeshe, I took care of him when he was very, very ill, just before he died. And he had, created this worldwide organization. He had amazing accomplishments, because this is back in the 80s when Buddhism, he was one of the premier leaders of bringing Tibetan Buddhism to to the West, or to the modern world. And when he was dying, just before he died, a couple weeks before he died, he would say, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied. And he said, I did my best. There was thousands of things to still do. But that wasn't his nature, it wasn't like this grasping. It's just really living in this moment, and each moment trying to make as meaningful as possible. Okay? I'm satisfied. I did my best. Pretty amazing. So, I don't know, inadequacy, involved in self-improvement projects, particularly around yourself, right? What's the motivation for people to go to so many self-improvement courses and retreats? It might be a spiritual, pursuit, but it also could be that they just don't feel good enough. Okay? So it's driven by, I'm not good enough. That's low self-worth. Okay? Again, avoiding risking failure, playing it safe. This is from Tara Brach, who wrote Radical Acceptance. If you're interested, there's a couple books written by Buddhists. I think they're written. They're not written exactly for the Buddhists. Well, maybe they are, but they're both therapists. One is Kristen Neff. I'm not sure she's a therapist. She might be a research psychologist. No, but Tara Brach is a therapist, and this is where I got a lot of this stuff I got from them. I just read it and thought it was useful. Withdraw from our present experience. That's like fear, right? You're intimidated. You withdraw. Or if you're in a situation that's difficult, or that you just have to I don't know, many tasks, many jobs that you find difficult. You just, people withdraw. You know people like that? You know what I mean? They don't confront it, they withdraw. Because they don't feel confident. Keeping busy and focusing on other people's faults. Okay, we could talk about all those at length, but okay. We're going to get out of this, I promise you. So this was interesting that for our this was what was spoken about. What I was reading about was contingent self-esteem. So this is the positive self-esteem. But there's two kinds: contingent and non-contingent, or conditional and non-conditional. This is if you want to talk about this, is really interesting, because contingent self-esteem is something. It's contingent. Your self-esteem is coming from something outside of you. And this we see a lot, and people are hooked on this as the real solution to low self-worth, right? Career, family, partner, right? What others say about you. So it's contingent about what others say. And then you get pretty hooked on praise. And you need that. In the Dharma, in the Buddhism, we call that in terms of the 8 worldly Dharmas, right? Remember that? Which we talk about praise, seeking praise, avoiding blame, criticism, then fame, and then gain, those kinds of things. So those, I would say, are self-esteem based upon the external factors. It's pretty funny, actually. Guys sometimes, I don't think, my wife hates it when I do this. I make these gender distinctions. I apologize. It's just a fascination. But it just seems, at least culturally, that often young men get a self-esteem from the car they drive. Is that true? More than women? Is that fair? Am I being sexist by saying that? It is, isn't it? I've done a survey of my own. I've asked people. But what is that? Why is that?
Because it's a symbol of an achievement.
It's a self achievement. And so men need external achievements for their self-esteem.
And they're competitive, so they race.
Mm-hmm. So what would be the equivalent, let's say, for a woman? If it's not a car, what's an external thing that, I'm sorry to generalize, I apologize, all those thousands of people out there, but just where you have to talk. So what do you think is kind of a common external condition that women might seek for their self-esteem?
A well-kept home.
A well-kept home, yeah.
I think the children.
Children, how they act, huh?
Children, how the children accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Children's so they yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
Very, very big in Asian culture. Yeah. And I think in the West too.
In the West too, but it does. I'm sorry.
For the mother.
For the mother, what the children do. It's interesting when we notice families or mothers that don't care about that. Well, no, I say don't care. What I mean is in a negative way. They don't care enough. So the children aren't getting that sense of. It's so interesting. I guess it's better to get some self-esteem externally than none at all. But it's very flimsy, right? Because as soon as it's not there, you get older. Like our looks, self-esteem. Like models have a tough time, or celebrities, actresses, actors. Actresses, reading this about actors is really, Hollywood is so sexist, because you can see the lists of men who go through their 30s and 40s, start as young actors and continue to be famous through the 30s and 40s. And then you see the list of women, and they all drop out after 32 or something, And it's like, wow. If your self-worth is based upon that external achievement, that's supposed to be pretty demoralizing. So that you could see that you could get very depressed. Same with athletes. A lot of athletes don't know what to do after they retire, from baseball players and football players, for example. They retire fairly young. So if their self-worth was coming from that. Anyway, you know all this. I think what's surprising to me is how it really is promoted in this culture so strongly. But I guess, like you're saying, Asian culture, something else is external. Now, I think that there's probably cultures that do that less. What do you think? That base self-esteem less on the external, less contingent, or do you think it's just pretty universal? Universal, yeah, yeah. You think it's different, yeah. I wonder if there's cultures that have more upon the non-contingent, which is what we're going to get to now. Hang on a second. Here's what others say: one's success and failure is one's competence. So it's disapproval versus approval. And you're looking to others for that approval and disapproval. Can you imagine living without that concern? Would you be a sociopath? So what's the difference between a sociopath and someone who doesn't look for others' approval, for their self-esteem? I've never thought of that before, by the way, so I don't have the answer to it. Yeah.
Well, very small children have, I could be wrong, but seem to have high self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And they go around taking what they want and whatnot. Then as they get older, kids tend to have lower self-esteem, and I don't know why. They're not sure of themselves necessarily. I don't know if some conclusion can be drawn from that, but it seems like if we never left that childhood state and we became adults, the very, very young childhood state, we would be sociopaths.
Yeah, the very young. Yeah, because it seems what you're saying about the very young child, they're not aware of that social awareness that I was talking about. So not really aware about how others are seeing them. The sociopath may not be aware either, or he may not just care. I have to think about that. It's very fast. It's interesting. It seems to me that someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche isn't worried about others' approval. He has great self-esteem, but not pride. It's not a narcissism or an egoism. He doesn't, but he has self-esteem. Where the sociopath doesn't have the self-esteem at all, I would say. Doesn't care what other thinks, and doesn't have a strong sense of value. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I'm just guessing. I'm not not in his mind. I wish I was, but I'm not. So he has, as an example, he has great confidence, but not pride. So there's something more which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. That there's more to this, but I'm just thinking about in terms of the not seeking others' approval. You still develop. The person still has the proper sense of self-regard. We have a word for that in Buddhist thought, and we'll get to it in a second. Okay. Now, non-contingent self-esteem, one is by nature acceptable and accepted. Now, that is interesting. An internal belief in one's okayness, and you're okay in spite of the flaws. So, very importantly, this maybe gives a little hint about the sociopath, doesn't believe he has flaws. And in Buddhist psychology, we are educated right from the beginning, we have flaws. So what happens is that bad self-esteem, positive, when I say bad, the one that's not helpful, is I think what I notice with children today, there seems to be a little bit of a movement of not that letting children know that they have no flaws. Okay? And almost this sort of, a lot of times when we talk about, millennials are not young people today, but, you kids, but, this sense that, it's overly, like we are extremely fortunate, and we do have exalted, unbelievable qualities, that we don't recognize for the most part. And so in Buddhist psychology, Buddhist path, we're taught early, right from the beginning, you're taught, well, you have flaws, though. So the difference is, I have a story. I'll just tell it right now. Wait, hang on a second. There. So how Tenzin washes dishes. Sorry. There's a very, very, one of my teachers, very, I don't know, just anyway, very amazing young man. Last lifetime, he was one of Lam Yeshe's, Lam Zopa's, in fact, one of the Holy Style Lama's teachers called Dzong Rinpoche. And, because we believe in this rebirth thing, he is recognized, we recognize high lamas that take rebirth and they're recognized again. So, he's right. He's about 33 now, 32, 33. And he came to live with us, which is, he's very high up in the Tibetan hierarchy. They have a very hierarchical culture, so not that we have to copy that. But they are. And so he's basically like a prince, but he's a prince in the sense based upon his accomplishments, his knowledge, his internal accomplishments. And he has to duplicate those this life. He can't just, slack off and say, I'm Dzong Rinpoche, and, like that. They have to study out even harder. They have to study and have to meditate, have to debate. They have to really, they have a lot that they have to show up as. And anyway, so he came to stay with us when he was about 11, which was very unusual. He stayed with us for about 8 or 9 months because he wanted to go to a Western school. The previous Dzong Rinpoche had told his attendant, my next life, I would like to go, can you please make sure that I have some modern education? So his attendant that previous life was the same as this life, Tenzin Wangchuk. So Tenzin remembered this, and so when Dzong Rinpoche was 11 or so, they didn't escape from the monastery, but a lot of the because he was so an important figure, they didn't really want him going out to the polluted, toxic, West, where he could, get lost in materialism and get corrupted, But anyways, Tenzin was very confident. He came and stayed with us. And so Tibetans in general, extremely kind of, they work hard. They don't like to slack off, and they were staying. So he was staying with us. Those days I was working up at Stanford, and so I'd come back about, I don't know, whatever, late, later in the evening, 7, 8 o'clock at night, and my job, because I'm not much of a cook, was always to clean the kitchen right after the dinner, but I couldn't get there quick enough because Tenzin would be in there before me, maybe clanging dishes and washing, and they and you got to remember particularly in those days, when they were washing dishes was usually like outside under a tap using the dirt as the grinding the food off, or here they were in a kitchen, right? And so there's not that difference now. Now, of course, it's modern there, but. So I noticed, so then I kind of took advantage of it, and I started, well, okay, I'll just watch the news or something, I'd watch TV. But then I'd be watching, and there's all this clang, clang, and all this noise. And sometimes I couldn't hear the TV for so well, and it's like irritating me because I was probably grumpy from being tired and all that stuff. And our kids were very young then, and so, and then I started noticing, are the plates more chipped now? Are there more chips in the bowls and the plates? Because I'm making up this story, right? And that, it has a clang, 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 and the chips, but what do you say? Because, he's doing it for you, right? What would you do? Would you say something? Would you not say something? Yeah, but see, sometimes I'm not very skillful, so then after many days, some days, and I thought, I gotta say something. So I went to I remember vividly. How you have those pictures in your mind, those events that happen, and you'll never forget them. Like even when you're 5 years old, and so there was one of those times. I went out, and I said, Tenzin? He said, yes. And I said, maybe you could do I don't know the exact words, but something. And maybe you could do the dishes a little quieter. And he just stopped, and he looked at me. And he said, okay. Why? Because he didn't have that. That's that thing, because for him, something to learn. I can do something better. Values. The values are different. I think where we're screwing up around modern day for us is the sense of values, that we're not united around our values anymore. Where I think traditional cultures, or even us traditionally, had, like I say, 100 years ago, maybe the parenting was more uniform because the values, I think, were similar. So Tenzin, yeah. And then he got quieter over the next months. And I felt like an idiot. So you see, with self-esteem, right, self-worth, he wasn't like deflated. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I've been doing so. That's what someone with low self-worth would say. For him, a learning moment, because he's confident. Okay? So non-contingent self-esteem is based upon internal understanding of your quality. That's the difference. And an appreciation that you're flawed. Once we get into Buddhist thought, the idea, we have to, so His Holiness Dalai Lama, I have that slide somewhere too. I'm all mixed up. Sorry about that. Well, let's go on. So high self-esteem or divine pride? What do you think? So divine pride might be a new word for people. Divine pride is a Buddhist term, a Tibetan, a Vajrayana term. Okay, it's not very common even in most of Buddhism. But I'm using it here because I want to. What divine pride is? Lam Yeshe was very. He was very. There's the line. It's my students who make no mistakes I keep my eye on, because I know then they're not doing anything. So what happens for the Tibetan, I'm generalizing, of course, but the reason they don't have this sense of low self-esteem in general is because they're educated from the very beginning that we are born and we possess a quality of Buddha potential. And it's because everyone can say, I'm not Buddha. I don't have an enlightened mind. That's obvious to everyone. So why feel bad? Because you can have an enlightened mind. That's the purpose of life. The whole purpose of life is to develop that quality in us. Each person has. Each living being has. That can be fully free of all problems, all misunderstandings, all ignorance, all hatred, all anger, all attachment, all desire, and subduing those afflictions allows this Buddha nature to rise. The reason it isn't awakened in us is because we're dominated by these afflictions or mental disorders or disturbing emotions. And so for the Tibetan in general, the Buddhists in general, they know that. That's the whole idea. Why should I be surprised when I screw up? There's no surprise. That's the nature of the world. That's the nature of being human, is to make mistakes. The very first teaching that the Buddha taught is that we're problem-oriented. Very first thing he taught. Four Noble Truths. The first teaching he gave. After he attained enlightenment, he wandered around for, I think, 7 weeks because he said, I can't explain this. It's too profound. It's beyond words, which it is, right? I mean, most things. If we say, can you explain love to me? We can't really do it, can we? We use all these metaphors and these symbols. You can't communicate the love. It's all through symbols. It's not love. So enlightenment, his experience of enlightenment, of course, is much deeper. He couldn't put it in. He felt, I can't explain it. There's no use trying to teach it because you can't explain it. And then after 7 weeks, somehow he got convinced that, he was convinced, actually, by different people to please teach. So the first thing he taught were the Four Noble Truths. And the first one being the truth of suffering. What a bizarre thing to teach. So in the Buddhist culture, they know that. It's not a surprise. But in our culture, we don't have a way to put it in context, do we? We don't have a way to explain it. When I was involved in becoming a therapist many, many years ago, the therapy models are very, very pathological. They're very pejorative. They're very disease-oriented. And so some models have developed in reaction to that, like positive psychology and narrative therapy and brief solution-focused therapy, where they don't focus on the problem. And then in consulting, organization development, there's appreciative inquiry, where you go into companies or organizations and you help them get out of their problems. They don't focus on the problem at all. All they're focusing on is the solution, what's right, what's good, what's positive. Okay, but so I was very involved in narrative therapy. Narrative therapy doesn't even present a psychology. It finds that if you talk about psychology, you get people too sort of hooked on problem view. So when I was doing this kind of work, I did find that it was lacking, because what was lacking was we weren't helping people understand the problem. Because from a narrative point of view, or appreciative inquiry point of view, if you talk about the problem, it becomes reified, it becomes bigger, it becomes more real, concrete. But in Buddhism, we don't say that. Buddhism, you have to know the problem, but it's not concrete, because the very fundamental thing is you have these problems are acquired. They're not who you are. So they know that from the beginning. So self-esteem is not, in general, is not damaged because you look at the problems of anger. You look at the problem of attachment. You look at the problem of self-cherishing, selfishness. It's like, if I don't look at those, if I don't understand those, how can I get rid of them? And I can get rid of them. That's the difference. So in our modern culture, somehow we're losing. So a lot of kids these days, parenting, it's all about positive, right? I'm generalizing, but I've seen a lot. I do have some contact with young parents, and there is. I'm not saying all. It's just a kind of a cluster of certain kind of parenting where, it's like this protection. When Siddhartha, the Buddha, before he became enlightened, his name was Siddhartha. And he was born in a very, very wealthy king family as a prince, and his father's mandate was, don't make sure the young prince doesn't see any dirt, doesn't see any suffering, no death, no sickness. That's what's kind of happening in some clusters of our culture with parenting. Keep them from any pain, any suffering. It happens a lot. It's the reason I have some contacts. My wife is a founder of a school, and she's still involved there. And she has to deal with the parents all the time. And some parents, like some other kid said to her son or daughter, and then it's like it's like all this whole thing about, because it's supposed to be perfect. It's like being Siddhartha. Okay. Any questions up to now? Comments? Something? I'm doing all the talking. Remember that California had a self-esteem commission? Did anyone remember that? I had to laugh when I said it, but I think I looked it up the other day because I was very curious what happened to it. It only lasted a couple years. Yeah.
I just thought of a question.
Sure, please.
How do we, especially in a professional business atmosphere, how do we be the ideal as much as we can be, humble and kind and accepting, without others judging us as having low self-esteem?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good question.
So I've been in office situations and interview situations where being balanced and grounded and admitting my positives and my negatives potentially has caused me to look like I don't believe in myself, or that
that's a great question.
I would be okay with perpetuating failure.
Right.
Like I would accept it, therefore I will perpetuate it, even though I was just trying to come from a grounded, real, authentic standpoint.
Question, I don't know if they can they hear that? No? So let me see if I can paraphrase it. So, question was, in a work situation or in a job interview, when I want to be authentic, it's admitting or being transparent about my shortcomings as well as my qualities, that I'm not seeing as then weak or
not competent.
Not competent. That's the word. Yeah.
Or too
accepting. So
to perpetuate failure instead of being competitive enough and hard enough on yourself.
Not competitive enough, not hard enough on
so
yourself.
So you look like a risk, in other words, to
a risk. You look weak. You look vulnerable.
Vulnerable.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I haven't thought it's a great question. Of course, you weren't applying to be a police officer, were you?
No, but it's such a
right. I mean,
competitive.
Certain cultures are going to look at it differently, aren't they? If you were applying as a preschool teacher, maybe be different, judged differently, right? If you're going into a high level professional, depends on the company, the culture. I mean, that's not my answer, but it is, context is sort of important too, right? Depending on what culture are you trying to enter into, because I can tell you, if working, as you know, I'm not telling you, but reflecting that company cultures are really different. And I did a number of consulting things. I was doing executive coaching, and one place I had similar situation. It wasn't my culture. You had to show up as strutting, big ego, or listening to a facade of being strong. I can't show empathy, but it wasn't my nature. So my nature eventually would come out anyway. And some people would see that as weak, definitely. But that company, the one I'm thinking of, their motto was brutal intellectual honesty. And I worked with that CEO for years. He started a couple other companies, and from working with me, I got him to get rid of the brutal. He decided that wasn't a good part of the value. So part of it is culture. I don't know where you were, the culture, the company culture, or the organizational culture. I think that when we get into looking at ourself, where self-image really comes from, what is real self-image, we should have this divine pride, develop this divine pride. Divine pride means I'm not this identity I think I am anyway. My identity is one as a awakening being, And if you look at the qualities of an enlightened being, there's no wimpiness there. There's compassion, but as Zone Rinpoche said, this young one, he said last year, someone asked about compassion, and he said, you have to understand, when we talk about compassion, it's not an emotion. Okay, it's not an emotion. Okay, it's a very powerful perception. It's a state of mind that's very powerful. Okay, when certain lamas, Tibetans, I should say, were being tortured by the Chinese, very bad. If you read some of these ways, I guess any torture is the same. It's all mind blowing. But anyway, in some of these Tibetan lamas, while in great pain, right? I mean, because they had compassion. They weren't allowing themselves to have, because they might have had fear and some other things, but they really guarded against anger and hatred of their torturers. It's very common. It's been researched amongst the Tibetan refugees. By the way, they had a lot less PTSD too. So we think that's not strong. That's not courageous. That's not brave. See what I'm saying? So it may be in the way you presented it, they misunderstood. But I think being inauthentic is not the answer either.
Is it genuine compassion in that situation if their motivation is to be reborn in a more enlightened state?
To benefit others, definitely. Absolutely. But the compassion there, my guess is the compassion they're generating is based, this is according to what His Holiness comments on this were too, those lamas, or those people, rather, should say, there were two things happening, not for all of them, but at least one thing happened for all of them. He says, we're a culture that believes in cause and effect, in karma. So as a culture, we knew we were being tortured was not their fault. It was our fault. I wish I hadn't created those causes. If I didn't create those causes, you don't experience the result. So that had a different effect on the experience. Okay? Then some very highly realized beings also then had not only that, but the idea of compassion towards their torturers. But the compassion was just based on fact, we could say, from Buddhist scientific fact, which is those torturers are the experience they're going to experience due to the karmic imprints they're creating. You wouldn't wish on anybody. That's the compassion. It wasn't approval. So, if you know someone is going to develop someone you don't like, and you feel all of a sudden, someone's mean or someone who's, not very attractive in a personality way, and then you hear, oh well, by the way, did you know he got diagnosed with ALS? Right? Your whole attitude changes, right? Unless you're really mean, then you say, he deserved it. I mean, some people might say that. But generally, we're generally kind people. Okay? So, that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's how I see it. It all came to motivation, yes. They also, depending on their level of realization, would not want anger and hatred to come up in their mind because they know the result of that is more suffering for themselves. They might be reborn in lower realms, something like that. Question? Yeah.
A comment from Aaron about could you speak on nihilism, please? And also from James about non-objectifying compassion.
Which one first?
Aaron was first with the could you speak on nihilism, please?
And by the way, for Robin asked about compassion, and so definitely it's here. I don't know how far we're going to get today. We're doing 2 sessions, right, on this topic. Okay. I'm not sure why nihilism came up. If the person was, I don't know if it's a man or woman, but man, if it could I speak on nihilism? Could he explain the context of a little bit better? I'll definitely speak on it. And the other one was what?
Non-objectifying compassion.
Again, I guess I said that. So non-objectifying compassion, I said non-emotional compassion, right? And James wants to know about non-objectifying compassion. Well, I don't know what non-objectifying compassion can mean different things. But let's just sort of turn it around a little second. To really understand compassion, what the mistake we make is we always think compassion is an action, which it is. Okay, but for the most part, when we're talking about compassion, developing compassion, that for example, those lamas or those people who were tortured and had compassion, they had a compassionate mind. It's a mind. It's a state of mind. And that state of mind then sees people differently. Okay, it's not about I'm going to see the person differently. That's not real compassion. That's contrived compassion. That's what we do. It's a good thing, but it's not real compassion. So it's kind of like, Urs is angry at me, but wait, he probably had a bad day today. That's good. That's good. He probably, I don't know what happened. He got fired from his job or something. He's in a bad mood. That is empathy, right? But the compassion we're talking about that's not the compassion. So non-objectifying compassion, if I understand it correctly, is understanding reality, which haven't talked about. Okay, so when we talk about reality, when we focus on reality, understanding reality. So when I see Urs, not that he got fired from his job, that's still non-reality. That's still based upon an ignorant view. I don't see in reality. If I see in reality, then I understand Urs in a very, very different way. So from that point of view of understanding reality, which is I don't think I can go into right now. It's going to get too complex. But that automatically generates compassion. It's automatic generates compassion. Not necessarily bodhicitta, but compassion. Every meditator, whatever school of Buddhism they're in, because we have many many different levels. When they perceive reality, they all have a development of compassion. Because that compassion then sees cause and effect. That's seen that reality. You actually, for the first time, you seen reality. What we're seeing is not reality. What we're seeing is all projection. It's completely misreality. Okay? When we see reality, then we see how things really are. And one of the things we realize is that all beings are in the nature of suffering. So we don't see suffering, by the way. Some of us are good at, seeing having an appreciation for suffering, but we don't see it. When we have a perception of reality, from then on we never see things the same anymore. And one of the things is we see things as the Four Noble Truths. So when we say the truth of suffering, and we can all sit around, have a class, and talk about it, and everyone goes, yes, it's true. We're in the nature of suffering. That's not it. That's good, but it's conceptual. When you see reality, it's non-conceptual, and then the understanding of suffering is non-conceptual. Okay? So if I understand James's question, that would be the non-objectifying compassion. Okay? But I'm not sure that is what he means, but that's how I see it. Does that make sense? It's a very deep topic. One of the things, when we see reality of shunyata or emptiness, or the emptiness of inherent existence, objects change. You can still recognize objects, but the duality diminishes. There's a non-dual experience of objects and subject. Best way to say it. Sounds like a contradiction, but it is. It doesn't mean I become Margaret. I still know that there's this body and mind here, and Margaret's there, but it dissipates this subject-object confusion. Is gone. I don't see her inherently there, and me inherently here. Wow, is that on? Was that? I wonder if that answered his question. And then the nihilism.
I haven't heard any expansion on it, but he just asked, could you speak on nihilism, please? Oh, here he comes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron. Nihilism seems to offer a defense against suffering, but I think it robs me of motivation too.
Yeah.
Keep trying to find something to work towards, but feel a bit lost. Not much seems to have meaning.
Yeah. Well, that's different. Okay, now I get it. Yeah. No, that. I understand that. I think sometimes these days there is a nihilistic trend that is happening, and what's his name? Is it Aaron? Is that his name? Yeah. Aaron's correct. Actually, this is the problem. He's correct. Things don't have any meaning. So what he's seeing is closer to what is reality, but it's not complete. Because if we think what we give meaning to, when we start understanding when we start looking at and thinking about how things really are, things begin to fall apart. So what was really meaningful becomes meaningless. But nihilism is when we deny conventional relative reality. And everything's just absolute, meaningless. In absolute terms, in absolute view, things are meaningless that we think are meaningful. But the beauty of this path is that things don't exist only absolutely. Things exist relatively too. You cannot see things absolutely if you don't have an object. It's not like the absolute, you can just meditate on the absolute or perceive the absolute. That's just space. That's not the absolute. To see the absolute, you need an object. And we choose objects, well, we choose every object, actually. There's no object excluded. But one of the objects the object that conquers nihilism the most is, Aaron, they're still sentient beings. Even though they don't exist the way they appear. Even though they don't exist the way they think they do. But they do exist. Nihilism says they don't exist. In shunyata, in reality, it never says you don't exist. This is so important. So I want him to study this. Okay? So nihilism says Margaret doesn't exist. Shunyata, emptiness, reality, we say Margaret doesn't exist the way she appears. That's different. We don't say Margaret doesn't exist. We don't say that your next door neighbor doesn't exist. We don't say that your parents don't exist. But absolutely, he's right, if this is what he's thinking. They don't exist the way they appear. That is true. But that's not the ultimate view. That's not reality. That's still skewed. That's why it's delicate. This topic of reality is very, very delicate. They talk about it as you're trying to handle this rattlesnake. It's hard to handle a snake because it's trolling all around. It might bite you. So if Aaron, I would encourage him to study more. Study. This is a problem for us in this tradition, is we believe, not a problem, but it's a challenge. Study is a big part of it. We can't just go on feeling and concept and ideas. I have this idea, and we do that a lot. In this culture, we're not so disciplined. You have to study. Now, I'm not saying you have to study like to the level of a PhD. You just have to have familiarity with the topics. Can't just assume. Okay?
James also followed up saying how Shantideva used it as a third stage of compassion.
Say that again. Shantideva.
Shantideva used it as a third stage of compassion.
Yes.
When he talks about the non-objectifying compassion.
That's what I think. So for James, I think that if I understand correctly, I think it's what I talked about at the end. The non-objectifying compassion. Another way of saying this, what is objectifying compassion? So objectifying compassion would be, Urs is really suffering today because he lost his job. He's objectified, right? But in reality, ultimate reality, when we really are in touch with how things really are, that is still a wrong idea. So the right idea would see, when I see Urs as in the nature of reality, excuse me for the technical language, but for James, seeing it in terms of dependent arising. And so independent arising is not objectifying, right? And so it's conventional reality. In that reality, the compassion generates because I can understand that Urs, whatever that being is, there's a relative reality there that takes rebirth, that creates karma. That's where the compassion comes from. But it's not emotional. It's just reality. Okay. I hope that answers James' question. Any other ones? Should I go on? Okay. Did I lose everybody? There it is. I found this picture. That's Lama Yeshe. And that's me in the corner. I had hair then. I think that's my wife's back of her head right there. So this was a very touching picture to see, because this was Lama Yeshe's last talk before he died. And I was the only one that knew he was sick. He was really sick. And he came down anyway to give a talk. And he talked about bodhicitta, the awakening mind, the kind heart of awakening mind that considers the welfare of all living beings. He had attained bodhicitta, in my belief. And that person who attains bodhicitta doesn't ever have any self-thought, self-concern. But it's all based on philosophy. The idea of self is very reduced, of course. He usually was very punctual, Lama. He was punctual that night, but he would only speak for an hour and a half or 2 hours because he knew that people couldn't take more, And so I was keeping my eye on my watch the whole time because he was, like I say, he was very, very sick. And so then after 2 hours, so I thought we were finishing, and he said, "Okay, let's take a pee-pee break." And I thought, oh no, he's not stopping. So as people are getting up to go outside or go to the bathroom, then I stood up and I said, Lama, I think you better stop. And he looked at me with that intent, really, like I just said the worst thing in the world. And he said to me, sit down and shut up. I didn't know it was his last talk. And if you can find this talk, by the way, it's online. It's pretty profound. No, I mean the transcript. We didn't have video cameras much in those days. Few. Okay. Does anyone know who this is? Stuart Smalley. Is it Smalley? Yeah. From Saturday Night Live. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. He was playing as a therapist, right? And it positive affirmations. Yeah. So what's it? Is this all we need? Is this all that we need? Just tell ourselves that every day. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. That captures this idea of self-esteem, which from our point of view is not real self-esteem, right? I mean, it could be, maybe it is real, or it could be diluted. Maybe people, get creeped out by this guy. For sure they did, right? So something's missing there.
Affirmations work for me when I'm doing them regularly, and then when I stop doing them, my low self-esteem comes back.
There could be a sign, yes. There could be a reason for that, as we will look at now. I think I'm looking at it now. We talked about tensing. Oh. Yeah, question? Okay, we'll leave that up there. Yeah.
This is a follow-up to James.
Uh-huh.
He said to your comment about Shantideva and the third stage of compassion, he said, yes, thanks. And then he also brought up divine pride seems a little advanced. Is
Yes.
there a practical way to develop good self-esteem?
Yes. We're going to do that. It might be next talk, though. Why I put this here? His Holiness, amongst also the teachers that I'm familiar with, Lam Yeshe used to say to me, he didn't understand it. So His Holiness, this is many, many years ago, 80s, had organized. Every year he organized a conference. Sometimes with psychologists, sometimes other kinds of scientists. And still till today, it's still the Mind Life conferences. They developed into Mind Life conferences, and so he was meeting with a number of psychologists and therapists. I think it was like 1986. No, maybe later. I don't remember when. And they brought up the topic of low self-esteem. And he said, "What? What's that?" And when we study all the different disorders and the afflictions, we have them all listed in Buddhist psychology. Not all of them listed, but I mean the main ones. There's really no affliction for low self-esteem. It's not there. Or guilt, and that's not there either. We seem to suffer a lot from that, in this. I mean, we could say guilt in this culture, and we all know, yeah. And we could say it's an affliction. It's not a positive state of mind. But it doesn't fall into the Tibetan culture. And His Holiness was confused what that was. And Lam Yeshe told me the same thing. What is this thing you got? What's this low self-esteem? So that gives you kind of a hint that it might be sort of culturally, socially constructed. So when we're young, our brains are forming. Now I'm going into brain and not mind so much. So when our brains are forming, now they know that the brain. When I was in studying for my master's in psychology, they were telling us that the brain fully develops by, I think, the age of 9. Anyone else hear that? Anyone else studied psychology? Yeah. Now they don't say that anymore. Seemed kind of weird then too, but anyway, the brain continues to develop until you die. it changes. So that's a kind of a development. Whether it's positive development or negative, that's a different story. So you think about now, we have a sort of a new metaphor in which to explain some of these things. So in your family, where it was try again, so as you generated meaning, so you would do something and it wasn't so good or you failed, and so the meaning you made around that. So the way I would make meaning, so like if I got a B on my report card or something like that, or test, I would generate different meaning than you were because of what was being told to me. And so that meaning making is all, we say it's verbal. Okay, it's not externally verbal, but it's narrative that's going on. There's a narrative that's going on, okay? It's not only that. There's concepts and there's images and those things too. But all those concepts, all those images, all those thoughts, all those narrative stories, descriptions are, if they tend to, then they'll take on more and more of a familiar tone. And those are what forming your neural pathways. So in my case, in your case, we've formed different neural pathways around failure, that's our mistakes. And that's all it is. It's funny. But the problem is these neural pathways are like ruts in a road. The more the wagon goes down that road, the deeper the ruts get. And it's also hard to get the wheels out of those ruts as they get deeper and deeper. The other thing is you keep going down that same road, you don't go down the road over here. So that road starts growing with weeds and grass, and pretty soon you can hardly see it. Okay? The beauty of this neuroplasticity and this neuroscience is that you can start to use that other road. Not easy, because you can't get how deep those ruts are. You can't get that wagon out of those ruts very easy. You try, but eventually you start going down a little bit and then you fall back in. Right? But the more you try. Now, Dan Siegel, who makes up all these little sayings, his saying around this is that use it or lose it. So when we're children, whatever you develop a sense of sort of functional way of dealing with mistakes, and I maybe developed sort of a dysfunctional way or not helpful way of dealing with mistakes. So your brain was, another part of your brain was functioning than my part of that brain. Okay? And you probably even developed some ruts. So you got those neural pathways. That's positive neural pathways are good. That's a good thing. So what happens with, when we talked about, remember, beginning of the hour, we talked about different things like, not getting much affection or attention or being criticized and those kinds of things. So those formed whatever meaning we made around that. Now, we all didn't make the same meaning. So let's say you have a family with, let's just say, two twin brothers, and dad's always criticizing them, right? It doesn't mean that each brother creates the same meaning around dad's criticism. One brother might think, might develop a sense that he's not good enough. What dad's saying is true, and I really can't. The other one might say, wow, it's really helpful what dad's saying because I feel I get to improve myself. It's possible, right? Unfortunately, it doesn't usually happen that way, but it's definitely possible. And of course, they're not going to be identical in their personalities anyway, because the way they deal with the meaning and the content. So the content does contribute to forming these neural pathways, but more importantly, it's the meaning and the story and the description and the voice and the concepts and the pictures and the images that have the greatest effect on forming. Because someone could yell at you, and you don't necessarily develop negative neural pathways or dysfunctional neural pathways or unhelpful. You could block it off. Well, then you create those neural pathways. Then your type of person doesn't listen to anybody or something. Can't hear criticism. Right? So that's about those darn neural pathways. And it's a good thing and a bad thing. Maybe we shouldn't say darn, because so what happens, I think, when we talk about really when low self-worth is active, it's very disturbing, isn't it? We get very upset. We get out of we just get out of control, so to speak. You might not sleep. You worry a lot, and your voice is going over and over in your head. And then, it's better if other people describe what happens for them. But these are just kind of, we all know what it is. But we get into a loop, and our loops are different. But when we feel bad about ourselves or inadequate, there's a tape that's going on, and it's very disturbing. And it's the one that keeps you up at night, if it's really bad. Okay, it's usually from a mistake, or maybe you got to face a challenge the next day, and you feel really unqualified. Okay, think about public speaking. You got to give a public talk tomorrow to 200 people on something you've been studying. That's a very common one where people feel they just feel very insecure. So what happens is, if we trace it, you usually can trace it to your childhood. And again, I'm talking from a modern Western psychology point of view. And you just think about, wow, if you really trace it, you can really see that you talked to yourself or heard information that supported you feeling unqualified to give that presentation tomorrow. And then you can't intellectualize yourself out of it either. Oh, I shouldn't be so worried. They're just a bunch of friends. Everyone knows, but it doesn't work, does it? Because of the neural pathway habits. You're in that rut. You allowed yourself. You could also prevent yourself from going down that rut, but it's pretty hard. It's so familiar to go down that rut. As we get older, we get better and better, and we can, we do learn, and we do. So one of the things that's happening in this neuroscience, and what happens in meditation is the same thing. So if I interviewed you and asked you, when you make a mistake, what do you think about? What's your reaction? What happens for you? And when you tell me about that, that's because that's part of your brain that's lighting up. And that part of my brain's not lighting up. But I can train it to. And so there's different techniques to train it. Visualization. Now, you were talking about positive affirmations. That is also one. But positive affirmations are not quite strong enough. Because with positive affirmations, they're often in reaction to a negative affirmation. So they're in juxtaposition. When you think about mistakes are okay and try again, it's not in juxtaposition to, I'm really working on, not criticizing myself for making a mistake. But positive affirmations are usually in juxtaposition to something that's a habit, a negative mental pattern we have. It's okay, but we got to be more vigilant and continue, because if we stop using the negative one, it'll die out. Okay? Sometimes the positive affirmation also is we don't quite believe it. That's why we're using it. We have to convince ourselves. That's all okay. But we can do more, and we got to go further. That's my point. To the place where we really are. The positive affirmation, or the functional, the productive story that we generate, or the information we generate, should be based upon our experience. That's kind of, so a lot of times, sorry to beat this thing to death about positive affirmations, but sometimes positive affirmations are someone else's positive affirmations. The trick is to find our own experience. Like, I'll give you an example. This is a simplistic one, or simple one. Golf, or athletics. So my younger son played baseball for like 10 months a year for many years through high school. So he didn't develop his golf game so much. He was a pretty good golfer, but he found it interrupted or interfered with his batting, his swing as a baseball player. So he quit doing it. So now he wants to play again. He's not playing baseball anymore. And so he'll hit a shot and go, oh God. Hit another one, oh God. It's going left. It's going left. It's going left. And then pretty soon, like, oh wow, you hit that really good. Oh no, well it was like but I was just, it didn't go very far. And do you see what I'm saying? So he's not paying attention. This is all of us. he's not paying attention to the positive affirmation, or the positive information, maybe that'd be a better way to say. He needs to he needs to pay attention to the thing that's happening that's in juxtaposition to the negative. Now, if you don't have that, if you don't see that positive, and then you use positive affirmation, it's good, but it won't carry quite the same strength. Eventually, you have to get your own authentic, internal, personal affirmations, which has to do with maybe not even a statement. It may be a visualization. It may be a remembrance. Like, he needs to remember those shots. And then, by the way, when he hits a bad shot, in order not to deepen that rut again, he needs to have a different story about that shot. And this is what we're going to talk about next time when we meet, because I'm going to wrap it up here. But we're going to go into solution. I'm really sorry, Robin. Can you come back, Robin? We will talk about the solutions. And one of them, the interventions, a big one is about compassion. Self-compassion, other compassion. Okay? So I'm giving that preview. Okay? Any questions? We just stopped a little early because I think it's a good juncture. Yeah. Yes.
You gave 2 practical things that you can do to improve your self-esteem, so I just am asking a question in case I missed anything. One is positive visualizations of your personal life experience.
Yeah, noticing. We call those. So the question is, I mentioned 2 techniques, or 2 things we can do to make that shift, and one was positive. What'd you say? Positive.
Visualization of positive life experience.
Yeah, visualization of positive life experiences. We have a name for that, not a Buddhist name. This is in terms of narrative therapy. They're called unique outcomes. Why they're called unique outcomes is because we don't notice them, but they're there. We pay attention to the familiar outcome. Oh, I keep hitting it over there. I keep hitting, I keep getting a B. I keep getting a C. I keep getting a B. I keep getting a C. Okay? So, but we're going to talk about that more. Visualization is a little different than that. Visualization yeah. So what was the second part of your question?
And then, you said affirmations could be good, but only if they're something that you truly believe from your past experience.
Well, affirmations are better than non-affirmations. So I was saying, but I think that what I was trying to indicate is that we need to go much deeper.
And then creating new narrative around negative past experience.
Yes. Creating a new narrative. That's what we're going to talk about next meeting. I hope you make it, but that's what we're going to talk about. And yeah, I just don't have time. But when you think of, here's a way of just sort of validating that. Maybe it's hard to do right here in this class, but if you think about when you really go into a low self-worth experience, if you pay attention, there's a lot of chatter about how you screwed up, or you're going to screw up, you're not good enough. We all have our own, these are sort of the broad themes around it, but we all have our own dialogue that goes on. That's a narrative. And that narrative is dominant. So the job is going to be to make that narrative less dominant, and then also to generate a preferred narrative that's more functional. That's part of what we're going to talk about in terms of interventions. Okay. And those are based on they're based on 2 things. One is, initially they're based on our own experiences, and then we enhance them, and we can learn new ones too. We don't have all of them. We don't have all the positive experiences, so we can generate other ones. It's through meditation, mind training. Okay. Education.
How long do you recommend meditating for when we're doing visualizations in the beginning?
It's 5 minutes. Yeah. It's hard to say. Everyone's different. But 5 minutes. So meditation, just to be clear, what we're doing is it's mind training. So it's a technique to train the mind. So then we have to think, well, people have so many ideas on meditation, and so what's the meditation training your mind to do? Some of it's not productive. People just have all these ideas. So, we have to look at what is being trained. And meditation is the primary tool for doing that.
Can we train ourselves out of chronic pain?
It seems people say you can, right? I think you, and I'm not an expert on that, but we can. So when I was driving over here, I was listening to a talk by His Holiness Dalai Lama. This is a little different. It's similar to what you're saying, and he was talking about this great. He was on this traveling to this area of India where he was going to give teachings. And I think he was on the train, and he started experiencing excruciating pain in his stomach. I remember when this happened. I don't know if he had appendicitis or I don't remember. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was. Anyway, I don't remember what it was. Yeah. So he had so he had the pain, but his relationship with the pain was very different. He said it helped him generate compassion for others. It's a really beautiful story, because when he had the pain, he was looking out the train window and he saw a very old, poor man, or whatever, laying on the street as he passed by, with nothing, basically nothing, a street person, which are millions in India, and just looking like, well, he has no one I have someone to take care of me. He has no one. He may have, his suffering is much worse than this pain, because I have someone. I can go to the hospital. I can have people around me taking care of me. Changes the relationship with the pain. I don't think we can get rid of pain, but we definitely can be not affected by it in the same way. Definitely, there's no doubt, because that's through mind training.
Because it relates to self-esteem. Because when I feel chronic pain, I feel less strong, and it makes me feel less empowered.
Chronic pain makes you feel less strong and less empowered. Yeah. So one thing you can ask yourself is that absolute, or is that something that can be changed?
The relationship to the pain?
Yeah. Can be changed, right? Yeah. Now, what prevents us from training is our minds are overwhelmed by it. So slowly we learn to be less overwhelmed by it, for sure. But it's very hard. But at the same time, each little bit you do, you get this sort of new quality of mental peace, mental control, happiness. Yeah. There's no choice. But you have a choice. See, that's the thing about chronic pain or pain, is we have a choice. We have a choice. Not whether the pain can come up or not. That I don't think, we're not there yet. We could eventually, but whether we're happy or sad, or happy or suffering, that's our choice.
You can feel pain and still be happy.
Absolutely.
Right, interesting.
Yeah. Lama Zopa Rinpoche had a stroke and was laughing when he couldn't move his arm.
Wow.
He's walking with this big limp, and it's very hard, and he starts laughing, like how ridiculous it is.
I think piggybacking off of that, when I have days where, with disability and pain, where I just, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Then it starts to chip away a little bit at my self-esteem, because I think a lot of the narrative we have around disability now is empowering.
Yeah.
And that's good, but then you see the sign that's like, he climbed Mount Everest blind. And that's great for him. But then it's like society was like, it's almost like society then goes, well, look at that guy, why can't you do that? And it's like, because I don't want to today. And so, where's the line of, choosing to be happy and just giving yourself a break?
Well, again, we'll talk about it. Yeah. The question is what's the line between being happy and giving yourself a break? I think they're the same thing, by the way. I don't see a contradiction between being happy and giving yourself a break.
Yeah.
The whole goal is to be happy, right?
Yeah.
So fundamentally, we have to believe that anyone particularly human, can be happy. Now, an animal is a different story. They don't have the capacity, right, I always tell the story that when I leave, I tell my dog, to say Om Mani Padme 100 times today. Don't forget to say it before you go. Can't do it. And by the way, those favorite dog bones, they're in the little cupboard there. You can open that. They're just in there, right? Animals don't have the, but we do. Now, granted that depending on people's situation, it's harder or easier. Definitely there's conditions that make it harder. It's harder for you, but harder for you also means, I believe, you have more opportunity to achieve something that maybe I can't. My sister-in-law, my wife's sister, is in a wheelchair, paraplegic. And I was talking with her one day in Australia. She's Australian. They're Australian. My wife's Australian. But we're watching something in Australia like that. It was a while ago, 10 years ago, about this chips that were implanted in people, and also they could move their legs and stuff like that. So I asked her, so Louise, would you want to do that? And she said, well, not if it took it away from someone else. And when you meet Louise, you don't see her wheelchair. It's not part of her identity. She's a very happy person. Even lying in the hospital bed with my wife at 16 and 18 years of age, and she was one making all the jokes, and I don't think she ever got depressed. Just her mind training from previous lives, I guess. Or whatever, it's her state of mind. I mean, I'm sure she has pain and stuff like that. But not depression, that's different. See, suffering, it's like you know what the good distinction is? The difference between pain and suffering. They're not the same thing. So yes, you can have pain, but not suffering. Another question? It's 9:01. What's the question?
So D asks, could a child's attachment disorder be caused internally by developing internal neural pathways, by believing one parent is better than the other, and one parent always busy, other parent always giving attention?
Depends how the child's making meaning. So a lot of the meaning that the child creates is going to be based upon the experience of the parents, because children will interpret their parents. They might interpret incorrectly, but they'll definitely, if the presentation of the parents is, let's say, discord or conflict or criticism or putting down one parent or the other, then the child experiences that. I don't know how old the child is. So read the question again, because I think I answered part of it.
Could a child's attachment disorder be caused internally by developing
Stop there. So the attachment disorder is internal. Let's make that clear. There's nothing but internal. Okay?
Caused internally by developing internal neural pathways?
Yes.
By believing?
Yep. So the neural pathways are generated through meaning that the child is making. And that meaning he or she is making is verbalized in its head. It's also experienced visually, auditorily, but it's not just the data. It's not just hearing something or seeing something. It's then generating mental activity about it, which is what I'm talking about, meaning making. But the mental activity that the child is making, if you want a different experience, create different mental energy. Is that it? Yeah.
And by developing internal neural pathways, by believing one parent is better than the other, specifically one parent always busy, other parent always giving attention.
That sounds like guilt, a little bit of guilt. Can you read from where the parent's better part? Sorry, I'm just trying to deconstruct it.
So by believing one parent is better than another, specifically...
So children do, I don't know how old the child is, so it's hard to say. Children, of course, they see their parents differently. At a certain point, they, more and more they see different. It depends on the age. And one parent better than the other, I don't know where this person gets that idea. How does he know or she know that the child sees one better than the other. You can't base it just upon the child saying, I love daddy more than you. That's not, you can't, I don't know where. We have to look at how that's communicated to the parent. And then, last part?
Specifically, one parent always busy, other parent always giving attention.
You can be always busy and the child experiences your love. It's how it makes meaning of that busy. So the parent always busy, does the child developing the sense that he or she is busy and therefore is avoiding me, doesn't love me, isn't giving me affection. He or she cares more about whatever he's busy about. And then the child self-reflects what that means about that caregiver's feeling about me. So we do it sounds like, yes, we want our children to develop a secure attachment to the caregiver. That's very important. But I can't say that someone's busy the busy person has to, if they care, they have to make an attempt that even within the busyness, that the child feels a secure attachment to them, that they feel the affection and care. But also, if there's one parent that is giving that, that's the child also will thrive under that, because often both parents aren't necessarily able to give the same level of affection for the secure attachment. So I think it's giving the child the more present parent would do well by building up the child's image of the other parent. Rather, what happens a lot is, yeah, your dad's never home. I don't know what he's doing. Yeah, he just works, or it's mom. It could be either way. That's not helpful. If it's a dad, let's say, maybe he's busy because he's trying to make a living and make resources so that his child doesn't have to worry about education, doesn't worry about health, doesn't worry about living in that neighborhood, can go out. Many reasons. To communicate that as love, then that helps develop the secure attachment. That's my idea, so I don't know. I just got to give the answer. I don't know, but that's I think that What do you think? Could be. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. See you. I hope you can come. You don't feel guilt or low self-esteem if you can't make it. We do record these put on Facebook, right? Okay. And then now we motivated 2 hours ago, right? Now we just think, okay, you just say, to think for a moment, a sense of appreciation that these kinds of conversations and these kinds of conversations, these kinds of interests, it's pretty rare. So we're very, very lucky to consider, wanting to improve ourselves so that we can improve the world. So just think, all this time together to dedicate this, these mental imprints and all these thoughts, this mental energy, not because we're pretty well off. I'm going to project onto you that you're well off too, mentally, emotionally, but there's so many that aren't. So I'm going to use this time together, these 2 hours, whatever I learned, whatever I developed, whatever I thought about, to bring the same level of understanding, well-being to others, both close to me and distant from me. Okay, thank you.